So welcome again, everybody. My name is Jesus Limon Guzman. I'm an English professor at Sacramento City College and union rep for Los Rios, LRCFT, Los Rios College Federation of Teachers. We're joined today by my colleague from American River College, Veronica Lopez, professor in nutrition. She'll be in the chat, so feel free to ask questions as we keep going, right? I'll be leading most of the presentation, but we will have the chat available for questions and comments. So that'll be sort of like the interaction that you see between us. So you can ask questions in the chat, or if you'd rather just kind of like vocalize a question, right? Feel free to, raise your hand and, ask a question, and we'll try to get to as many questions as possible. We will have some time also at the end for questions and answers. So, feel free to join in, or feel free to, if you're like me, where you kind of need some time to process information before you can jump into a conversation, feel free to do that as well. So today we're talking about applying for full-time tenure track jobs in the California community college system. We'll put emphasis obviously here at Los Rios. And we'll be sharing our experiences, right? From various degrees, right? From our own process of, how we went, the process that we went through when we applied and got our positions on our, prospective campuses, but then also from serving on various committees, right? To try to demystify that process, yeah? So we'll start, just an introduction of what we'll be doing today. One, we're going to talk about like how to prepare your professional materials, right? So your resume, your cover letter, the application, right? What should be your guiding perspective, right? What should you use to help you draft those materials? Then we'll talk about, understanding the broader trends that are in the field right now. Some ways that you could help prepared. To apply for these positions and would be, as best informed for the interviews or for your, your letters of interest, your resume, so on and so forth. And then the last part, we'll touch on the interview process, right? What you can expect during an actual interview, a job interview at Los Rios and in most California community colleges, and then the role that letters of rec play and all that kind of stuff, right? So we want to begin. And also, sorry, we'll have some sample job descriptions. We'll have some screening forms that have been used in the past. So we'll be reviewing some of that, right? Like the screening forms, some job letters, and then we'll also provide a bit of a resume guide. So we'll have some materials as well that we'll be happy to send out to folks that are in attendance today. So you will have some materials at the end of this presentation, right? So it won't just be me talking the whole time. You'll be able to walk away with something, tangible that you can apply for your, if there is a job coming up that you want to go after, you'll have some materials to use in that process. But again, we want to start. Yeah.
Jesus, Belinda arrived, so she's also here.
Cool. Yeah. So we're all here now. Myself, Veronica, and Belinda. So the first thing that we want to start with is or really the reason why we decided to have this workshop a couple semesters back is because there's so many myths around applying for a job, a full-time position within Los Rios or at California community colleges. And so we want to kind of hear what are some of those myths, right? So what are some, we're going to take about 2 minutes or so, just sort of like talking about or identifying what folks believe are some of the myths that or some of the things that you've heard about the hiring process or what it's like to get a job at Los Rios. So feel free to chime in if you've heard something, if you've heard, some of these what we call myths about the hiring process. So you can input them in the chat or you can verbalize them if you like. We'll give folks some time to to get their ideas going. Okay. So we're starting to see a couple of these come in. One that you would have to be a PhD to be tenured, right? That you have to have already been an adjunct to apply. That it's impossible, and you need to know somebody, right? That you got to be able to be a part of the cool kids already, I guess, if you will, to get a full-time position. I've been told I need to have worked multiple campuses. Oh dang, or start commuting to Napa or Yuba, right? That you have to put it, the major theme around that is that you have to put in your time, right? That you can't just, that you can't just, either come in out of a graduate program, or that you can just come in out of, transitioning from maybe like the private sector or some other institutional levels, and just come into a full-time position, right? There's all these different myths about, I don't know how to describe them, but this whole notion that you have to have earned the opportunity to even apply, It's about the amount of time we must put paradues before being considered. This is too much. Yeah, so we're going to talk about all of these. Yeah, I've heard that one too from Brandy, that you won't be able to, that you have to leave Los Rios to get a full-time job, right? Like you have to prove yourself in some other college before Los Rios will give you a full-time or tenure track positions. Yeah. Okay, so I want to highlight that all of these, I mean, there's a reason why we're saying that these are myths, right? Because as you'll find out, most of these are just, myths, right? I mean, myself included, when I was finishing my graduate program, I remember, I asked to meet with a member of my department now, a former colleague of mine. She's retired, and I've asked her, hey, I'm really interested in, coming back to Sacramento City College. I was a student here. I'm finishing up my master's degree, and this is what I want to do with my life. And oh man, like the things that she told me, like in retrospect, were so off, right? Because like, you have to publish, you have to do research, you have to, you have to put in your year, how old are you? She like asked me how old I was, and she was like, oh yeah, you're not gonna get a full-time job for at least another 10 years, right? You have to sacrifice, you have to be, go teach at Delta, teach at ARC, teach at CRC, teach at Sac City, right? All of this, all these things that now I know were complete myths, right? But it might have been, that might have been the conversations, right, when she applied, or that might have been a standard, or part of the culture when she applied. But all of those were, significantly irrelevant. Most of these things, as you will find out, are in fact just myths, and kind of just like, how, what would you call them, to my other colleagues that are here, Belinda and Veronica, are like rumors, or what would you say, or what's another way to describe these, the way folks describe getting a job at Los Rios?
Yeah, I think because I was a part-timer I worked at CRC, Sac City, and ARC. So I just remember also being told like, you just, I think it's something that I saw in the chat box. I think Marie said it, like, if you don't get a job within the third time or the second time you try, you're not going to get it. So I know that was kind of what I was experiencing at the time. And then just also the kind of it just felt like they were just untangible expectations, right? And I don't know whose expectations they were. Like that to me was like, well, how am I supposed to do that if the opportunity is not there? So, and it kept feeling like the expectations were changing. There was no consistency in the expectation. So that felt sometimes to me like very frustrating.
It's also sometimes like a game of telephone where, well, I heard from someone who heard from someone that, let me pick something here that you said, that you have to pay your dues. But no one's willing to tell me how many years it takes to pay your dues. And then what ends up happening is someone, I'll give you my example. I didn't adjunct at Los Rios at all. And I got, when I got the job here, and so then they're like, well, she didn't pay her dues. So how is she able to sort of jump the line? And I think that's another myth, that there's some sort of line that you have to get into. And I think that's part of what we're going to talk about here is there is a bit of a method to the madness, and it's a lot more about how we can help you package your application, not just from here, but across the state. And it is madness at some levels, but like I said, there is a sort of consistency in how you package yourself that I think all three of us will sort of highlight. So, but I will tell you that it is a little bit of a game of telephone, but you also don't ever know who the original source is. And so if you can't go back to who the original source is, it can really get blown out of proportion. And there are things that I've heard that I'm like, how is that possibly true? But
I like how you said paying your dues, because that's like so random. Like what dues? Like here, I can give you my dues.
Yeah. And it's so interesting because the three of us have had three radically different roads that we come from, right? Whether it's been working part-time at multiple colleges, to not having any part-time experience within our college system or Los Rios, to like myself, I adjunct I think for 3 semesters, and I just applied just because I was like, okay, well, there's an opening. I mean, I better get good at this interviewing thing, because according to everybody, I'm gonna have to interview 10 different times before I get offered a position. And then I got the position. So it's interesting that there's all these different, that even within our conversations, right? Like the three of us, we come from, 3 different paths, which goes to highlight that there is no one way, right? There's no one particular way to land a position. But to Belinda's point, and again, as you'll find out as we go into the next slide, there's a very unique formula and a very unique process that Los Rios operates with. And in most, I think it's very, it's pretty universal across California community colleges. And so really there are ways that you can prepare for that process, regardless of whether or not you have tons of experience being an adjunct, or, you're coming from another institution, or you're coming from the private sector, right? And so that's what we are going to talk about next, everybody.
Yeah, and Jesus, so I want to add, so as you talk about, we all had different paths, I applied 4 different times. Mm-hmm. Right. So the 4th time was the one that I think when I got it, I cried, because I had did the interview at least 3 times. That 4th one, I was like, oh my gosh. So yes. Yeah.
I would also tell you that I'm the person who had no community college experience when I applied and got the gig. So again, this is where I was talking about packaging, but I did have, I had taught at a private liberal arts, I'd adjuncted in Cal State, but again, this is as we're seeing in the chat, these things about packaging, right? And part of what we're going to talk about is knowing yourself in terms of this is where I'm absolutely amazing, walk on water. And I'm also going to say, being willing to say that even if it goes against some of our cultural norms to brag, right? Depending on where you come from, but this is where I walk on water, but also knowing your areas for improvement or weaknesses, and being able to talk about, this is still how I can meet the needs of your department, of this job, etc. So, but I just saw that Jesus switched to the next thing, and we'll also engage in the chat as well. So
yeah. So so I think because I just kept saying we're gonna talk about this and we're gonna talk about this, I was starting to grow a little, self-conscious of whether or not we were actually going to talk about it. So I wanted to jump ahead into this, right? Which is, I think this is probably the most important slide, everybody, of our presentation, right? This breaks down what the screening process is like at Los Rios, right? And so as somebody that has served on, multiple committees, both as a committee member, hiring committees, both as a committee member, but then also as an equity rep, right? I've learned that this is a pretty, is a standard formula, right? I mean, this is just as standard as it gets, right? It doesn't matter whether it's, the committees have been for hiring a tenure track position, a management position, right? This is a pretty standard process. And if you understand this process, this could really help you it can really help demystify the hiring process, and it could also put you in a good position to prepare the materials, right? And like Belinda said, figure out a way to best present, yourself as a professional for the position. So the first thing that happens is that, there's a convening of a committee. And what happens is usually that there's an area dean who oftentimes serves as the chair of that committee, equity representative, and there are department and content experts, right? So these are, probably faculty members within the department that you're applying to, right? So that is typically the makeup of that committee. About how many people would you say is a standard? Is there a standard number, Belinda, or does it just kind of like depend on the chair?
I think it's usually, I think a minimum, I think it depends on the size of the department, but it's usually a minimum of 3 faculty members. And then the dean, and usually a associate vice president of instruction or associate vice president of student services.
Gotcha.
So I would say that makes it a minimum of 5, but I've been on committees with as many as 9 people. Does that sound about what you guys have had?
Yeah. Yep, very similar. So here's the important part about this piece, everybody, is that for every position, there's always a new committee, right? So that already goes to demystify the idea that if you didn't get one, if you applied once and didn't get the job, that they don't want you, right? Like this whole notion that, well, I already got 2, I already went for the position twice and I didn't get it, so I might as well just stop trying, or I might, I should go apply somewhere else. That the reason why that doesn't make sense, or the reason why I say that that's a myth, is because every single time there's a job posting, it's a new committee, right? There may be similar committee members, right? Like there may be, maybe the dean is the same, right? Or maybe a couple of the, the faculty members are the same. But I would say that that's rare, right? Even the dean being the same, right? Because, there's a lot of turnover in administration as well, right? That, deans move around. So it may be that by the time if you applied one year and apply another year, it's very likely that you're going to get a whole different committee, right? And so what happens after the committee convenes is that they review the job description and create a screening criteria. Now, this is also incredibly important because the screening criteria that the committee will create, right, will come directly from the job description, right? The job description is like the golden document, is the most important document in this whole process, right? The reason why I say it's the most important document is because the job description is going to inform the committee on what screening criteria they developed, and then also what interview questions they come up with, right? So the interview questions and the screening criteria is going to come directly from the job description, right? So the committee, we'll spend some time, like, when I've served on the committee, we'll spend some time, reviewing the job description, annotating the job description, brainstorming for screening criteria, brainstorming for some possible questions, right? And then we'll sort of piece together that screening criteria that we're going to use to evaluate the application packets, right? So that's what happens next, is the application review, right? The paper screen, where we look at that screening criteria and apply it to what folks submit, right? So to the resumes or cover letters, the letters of recommendation, the degrees, right? Like all the different things that you submit in your application, we're going to use that screening criteria that, again, comes directly from the job description to, select folks that are gonna interview, right? And so that's actually, much to my surprise, it's actually a much more boring experience than what you would think, right? I think I had this idea that the committee was going to get together in a room and argue over candidates, and no, that candidate is not, it is not that at all. It is quick. It is a quick process. Like, what did you score, right? What did everybody score? We don't even look at names, right? I think, no, we don't. Like, by the time that we get to that screening process, we just kind of look at, what different candidates score, and then create a decision of up to what number we're going to interview, right? So we'll say, okay, we'll have I don't know, whatever that number is, but we'll say if candidates are scored above this number, we'll get an interview. So that might be like 7 candidates, 8 candidates, or so on, right? But again, it's typically a pretty quick process, right? It's been as short as like 10 minutes. The committee convenes for about 10 minutes. quickly makes a decision, and that's it, right? It's not a lot of back and forth about why a certain candidate should get an interview over another or anything like that. So once was there a question? Sorry.
Well, I was gonna just say if I could add in like just
Yes,
two little
please.
things. One is that by law, the committees cannot add anything into the screening process that isn't already on that job description. So out of nowhere, as a nutritionist, Veronica can't all of a sudden add, and you must be able to teach, nutritions of the world, blah, 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 if it wasn't listed there. I mean, there's a lot of arbitrary stuff that kind of comes up that people like to, and this is why there's an equity rep on the committee, and I think some of us have served as equity reps, is that we're there, the equity reps are there to sort of police, for lack of a better way of putting it, if they're trying to put criteria in that is not on the job description. So we really recommend that when you go into CCC Job Confer that you pull down the job description if there's a supplemental, because some of them have these supplemental links, that you pull both of them down and highlight kind of keywords in the job description. So by law, know that the committees cannot do that. And then the score, in terms of scoring, the one thing that they predetermine even before they read applications is the weight of particular questions. Most committees that I've been on, you put a lesser weight to like your educational credentials. So maybe like 5 points for your educational credentials, but they'll say it's 10 points for demonstrating equity practices in a classroom, teaching in discipline X, like sociology for me. So they may weight particular things a little differently, but it's very, as Jesus said, it's very formulaic and driven by compliance with the law.
Yeah. So yeah, pretty much. And I've been in multiple committees, right? Where sometimes it's not even the equity rep, right? It's either another committee member or the chair, right, of the committee that will say, no, that's not in the job description, so we can't ask that, right? Or we can't go outside of the parameters of the job description. So I feel like, there's enough people within the committee that are there to exercise these things, right? So it is the job of the equity rep, but it tends to be, at least in my experience, across different committees, that most folks are pretty good at that, right? Stay within the job description. So that's why we say the job description is probably like the most important document for this process, right? So after the committee identifies the people to interview, they interview the candidates, right? Then the committee again makes recommendations based on the scores, right? Sorry about that, everybody. I skipped ahead. The committee makes a recommendation for who should move forward. And then the finalists, right, interview with the president or designee VP of instruction, or the VP of that area, right, and the area dean. So again, it's a pretty it's less exciting than what I think a lot of people think, right? There's no, again, like discussion about, this person hasn't earned it yet, or they only did, all the different myths that we talked about, right? Those aren't a part of the process. At least I have not seen that be a part of the process. It's usually, again, a pretty bland process of just like scoring the professional materials, right? The resume, the cover letter, all that based on the screening criteria, using the job description to create the screening criteria. And then in the interview, just going off of what the candidates say, right? Like just kind of like scoring the person or scoring the answer. They're not even scoring the person, right? They're scoring the answer and then adding up that tally. And then that's how they get to decide, usually how they get to decide what candidates move forward to the final round of interviews. Anything that I missed there, either Belinda or Veronica, with the
there was a question in the chat. I don't know, I guess it was is there a minimum number of applicants?
I was gonna go ahead. I was working on typing that, but I just realized it was so complex. I was actually gonna say that there isn't necessarily a minimum, in that you could have, for example, 200 applicants to a job and they decide to interview 14. Or it could be a smaller pool of 35 and they decide to go with 7. But there are 2 things that where they may tell the committee that they actually have to interview more people. One is by contract, by LRCFT contract, there must be 2 adjuncts in the pool for interviewing. So let's say they selected 7 and there was only 1 of our adjuncts from English in that pool, right? HR would say you need to add the next adjunct who is qualified on your list to be interviewed, to a first level interview. The second thing that they also do would also be, they could also tell you, and I think Jesus and I were on a committee together where this happened, the pool isn't diverse enough. And so then they actually said we need to add 5 other people into the, 5 more people to interview. So we went from, I think, 7 to 12 in terms of interviewing. So they had us add another 5 people into the interview. They never subtract people, they add people, if that makes any sense.
And then there's been committees, or I've served on committees where there was only like 4 people that interviewed, so it was like pretty small pool, right? Only 4 people, interviewed. And then there's been other times in the committee where, the committee just decided we have one candidate, right? Like we've identified one candidate that we'd like to move forward, and then they just move one candidate forward, right? In terms of the final round, right? Not at the beginning, but at the final round. So, it varies from committee to committee, right? Which is, again, why I think it's important to recognize that each committee is completely different. And just because, it doesn't go well for a candidate in one job posting doesn't mean that that's going to persist, forever.
And I would say across the state, right? Some schools, et cetera, per their hiring manual may say that the final round must have 3 people. The instructions, at least at Sac City, which may differ from the other presidents, right, is that we've, generally speaking, since Michael Gutierrez has been here, has said, make sure that, we'll tell the committee, make sure you forward the people you're willing to work with. So if number 3 on your list is, for the department, like, we're not sure, but we only really feel confident about the top 2, they may only forward that 1 or 2. But in some parts of the state, maybe 3. Some of them will say a minimum of 3. So they may have 5 that go to the second round. For example, when I was interviewing back in 2014, Pasadena City College actually had 3 rounds of interviews and not 2, although the typical standard across the state is 2. So just know that this may vary a little bit, but again, that final round, generally speaking, I've never seen it here in Los Rios. I've never seen it go beyond 3. I don't know about you all.
So I want to just make sure there was another question in the chat box. If we have a website, does that get factored in?
If the person has a website?
Yes.
So unless they identify it within their materials, right? Unless they submit it, because we're not supposed to use anything outside of the materials that get submitted, right? So if, even if I know the person, right? If I know the person and I've worked with them, I've collaborated with them, and I actually know a lot more than what they present, I can't use that information that I have to score that person, right? So I can only use what's been, and then, that's actually a really good question, right? I can only use, in the screening process, I can only use the materials that they submit. And in the interview process, I can only use what they articulate. So if I know that person, I've collaborated with them, I know they could do a lot more, but they didn't say it, I can't bring that information into the screening. Or if they didn't document it in their resume, I can't use that to give them that score, right? And so likewise, I can't go snooping, right? I can look up their website or look up their Facebook or their social media, and use that content or that material to evaluate them, because that's outside of the parameters, right? That's outside of the materials that they submitted. So that's what makes this, again, a pretty standard, and less, more boring than people think it is, right? Is we stick to the job description to create the criteria. We use only what the candidate submits, and then when they interview, we use only what they articulate to evaluate or score them.
Yeah, and I would agree with that, Jesus. That's been my experience being on committees too, is that we're told you cannot use anything outside. It's only what is in front of you, given the criteria that we have. So it's very, like, just very straightforward.
And again, because some of the committees that I've served on, there's been a lot of internal candidates. Folks are really, they're pretty good at saying, we can't know just because you work with that person and they did that, you can't use it here, right? Folks are pretty good at that, at checking each other, right, to make sure that the scoring that's happening is reflective of the materials that are being presented.
So there's a couple of good questions here that I think we should make sure we're capturing.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I want to note that the PhD is not a PhD is not needed for tenure. You need to think of tenure as a separate thing. Once you're hired as a full-time faculty member, you have to have 4 successful reviews, 1 per year, and then in your 4th year, as long as you've met the standards for teaching professionalism service, you would be successfully tenured. And that, it could be that you get a recommendation in your 2nd year, you just have to address the recommendation, similar to what you already do as adjuncts. Actually, the evaluation form minus a couple things is almost identical. Second, in terms of there are minimum qualifications to teach, and that will be listed in the community college system. I have never seen PhDs are not the minimum qualifications. In most fields, it's a master's. And then I think I'm going to get to Richard's questions here, with the exception of those who are in the trades, in which case a lot of it could be bachelor's plus certifications. When you read the application job description, there is an area that says minimum qualifications, and that's where you're going to want to make sure that you go through it. But there is also a process called equivalency, in which, let's say you've worked in, while they may say master's degree, but you have a bachelor's degree, 20 years of experience, and like 12 certificates in aeronautics, right? What we do is they have this listing of credentials that you've achieved in the trades that serve as an equivalence to having the degree that they're asking for. And so one of the things you may come across is them saying you need to fill out an equivalency form if you don't have the degrees. That's a real specialized thing that I would tell you call HR to understand the equivalency process, but you could probably also email us. And I don't want to go down the road of equivalency here because it's a much more technical thing that's by each discipline. And it's evaluated by the faculty in the department about whether you meet the equivalency. And then the last question here was about diversity in the hiring manual. I don't have the hiring manual handy. It's the Senate passed it 3 years ago. But basically, generally speaking, is that they would like to make sure that our pool adequately reflects the population of the areas we serve. For Jesus and I at Sac City College, right, is definitely going to be the areas, the service area of Sacramento City College. For Veronica, American River College. But basically, part of what they're trying to prevent, that historically what has happened at Los Rios and across all of higher education, is that women, people of a certain age, people from historically underrepresented racial and ethnic groups have been shut out because of this idea of goodness of fit. They're not a good fit for the department. This is also why the equity rep exists, because some of the informal conversations that used to happen before all the California laws went into place was this very loose conversation of they're just not a good fit. If folks even use those words in a committee, like I'm an equity rep, actually I think all 3 of us are equity reps, right? At least I know Jesus and I think are equity reps. We put the kibosh on it and we're like, no, you're not allowed to say that. You need to take that off, and we can't consider it. So, but it is that we should have a pool that reflects our service area, is I think how it works. And you can look up the, under our Senate documents, you can look up the hiring manual there. I'll try to get the link to send out to folks as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so as we keep going, for job descriptions, right, you can visit the California Community College Jobs, the CCC registry, to look for, for these job postings and look at job descriptions. Some general tips for the next 2 months: check the list at least once every 2 weeks, and then make sure that you download the detailed job description, right? So the job description, again, is gonna identify all the things that the committee can use to screen candidates and to ask questions, right? So that's really, again, I tell folks this all the time, is when you're applying to a position, when you're preparing your resume, when you're preparing your CV, or when you're preparing your letter of your letter of interest or your cover letter, you should have the job description right next to you as you're preparing those materials, right? So that you can look through and say, okay, did I talk about that? Can I do that work? I have experience in this bullet point. Let me make sure that I articulate that, right? So that you can make it easier for the screener to quickly identify those pieces in your materials, right? So that's something that I think is one of the most helpful tips that I received when I was applying, right? Is to make sure that I became, well versed in the job description that I was applying to, right? It so happened to be that, when I was applying to my position, it had a particular emphasis, right? They were during that time they were hiring for somebody to take over the Puente project on my campus, right? So I was like, oh, I have tons of experience in, community organizing and working with, Latinx communities, not just because of my own background, right? But because of the work I've done. So I made sure that I highlighted all of that stuff in my resume, right? And so that's something that some folks don't spend enough time doing, right? Download the detailed job description, look for anything that they're looking for in particular, right? And then draft your materials, right, to match that job description. Even your letters of recommendation, right? I would say, as you talk to the people who are writing letters of recommendation, if you can, right, to say, here's the job description that I'm going for, and maybe even highlight a couple of things that they might be able to speak to, right? Like if you had a supervisor that has knowledge about your equity efforts, for instance, right? Ask them if they could speak to that. So those are just a couple of steps that I think folks can take to make sure that they give themselves an advantage in this process, right? Or use their understanding of the process to give themselves some leverage.
So, and then Jesus, I want to jump in. So what I would also add to, because I think there was a question in the chat box, like, how do we know when positions are going to come up? One of the things that before a position goes onto the job list, friends, Academic Senate, they, at each of our campuses, there's a process, a hiring process, right? And so if you and all Academic Senate send out meeting notes, right? And you can use those meeting notes to see what academics said in regards to hiring prioritization. That's going to go to the campus president, and depending on what happens there is then they get to decide what positions are going to get filled. So you'll be able to know at least a couple of months before they're actually posted onto the system. And so I think what Jesus is also, it's very important in regards to what Jesus is saying, is that having enough time, right? One of the things that like I've mentioned before, I applied 4 different times. The last time, I had my cover letter, I had my CV, but what I did differently the last time is I actually asked someone outside the district to review it, someone with fresh eyes, right? Because I think sometimes it gets, I'm so in it that I can't see it. And so I need someone who is outside to be my critical friend to like, wait, this isn't jiving with the job description. I don't know what you're going to bring uniqueness. What uniqueness are you bringing to the position? And so that takes time. And so I would encourage you guys, check out those Senate meeting notes, so that way you guys can get a feel for what's coming down the pipeline. That can actually be very beneficial. And I would encourage you guys to find someone who is outside that has fresh eyes that can look at your materials. Because that to me, I think was the difference. It made a difference.
And also, from those Senate minute notes, you might also, gain some awareness of what is the need for that position, right? What is the department? What need is a department trying to fulfill, right? So you can look at the notes for that, right? Because I'm assuming that the notes will document, the request of the department, right? And it'll say, hey, we need this position because we have, this issue, right? And so, or, we're running into this issue, whatever it is that they articulate. That's great insight that you can take full advantage of and prepare your materials and also prepare yourself, right? Because some of the things that we were gonna highlight, and actually, we'll highlight those a little bit later, is how do you have an understanding of, the department, the campus, there's all these different broad things that you could do, right? But I think, Veronica just highlighted a crucial point. If you look at the 7-minute notes to that campus, and you'll be able to read, what the department said for their request for that position.
Yeah, and I was just messaged by one of our colleagues here, it is a very rigid timeline that happens at the same time every year. So I actually believe it's normally in October, both, well, every campus is different depending on whether they have 2 or 4 meetings, but normally in October is when they do presentations and rankings, and then they reconcile it against the exec team, which is like the vice presidents and the president, and then the deans. I will tell you that oftentimes the difference in how they rank is that the admin side, and I'm going to say deans and the vice presidents and president, are going to look at quote unquote productivity of the department. Let me give you the case in point. This year we had 2 chemistry hires at Sacramento City College. It is because that they actually, they have been regularly having to cancel classes that were filled, 40 students plus full waiting lists of 20. And that's money on the table to the district. I'm just gonna be straight up, right? Productivity is money on the table to a district. And they can't find enough adjuncts to teach those classes in chemistry. All of their preference adjuncts and adjuncts that they've been able to bring in are maxed out at the 0.67 level. So they end up having to cancel. So the concern for them is how do we make sure we meet the demand, what they see as guaranteed demand. At the department level, most of the time, the pressure is usually around the number of retirements a department is seeing. But if you had a retirement, but you're in a department that isn't productive in terms of number of students enrolled and completing classes, they may reallocate that position to a place like chemistry so that they can meet the demand. And that's normal at all 4 colleges. So just because, that's the other thing I would tell you, is just because someone retired in a department doesn't guarantee that department a replacement. And then also from a timing perspective, because someone was asking me, does your adjunct time count towards your tenure? No, it does not, unless you have fulfilled, unless you were hired as a long-term temp, which basically means that you worked full-time for 6 months or a year. That LTT time does by law apply towards your tenure count. So we have some folks, we settled a case with the district where about 15 of our folks, this is about 3 years ago, all got 1 year credit towards their tenure because they'd served as LTTs before they came in. And that's by contract. And it also counts separately for your salary placement. So a lot of the questions about your adjunct time, a certain amount of your adjunct time will also count towards your step placement, but not all of your adjunct time. I think it's 2 years by contract, it might be 3. Sorry, I can't remember the number off the top of my head. So those are things that we want to talk about. I think towards the end, we could, there's a question about some tips about the second interviews, but we could fill that in towards the end.
Yeah, and I'll sort of, move a little bit quicker to the other things because we addressed some of the slides already. So again, screening criteria, right? It comes directly from the job description. So again, this is just an example of a screening criteria. This is what it actually looks like, everybody, right? So, they'll say, okay, we're looking for somebody with instructional experience, distance education experience, equity-minded focus, right? And they just rank, right, your materials based on this like sample screening criteria, right? And again, keep in mind that the screening criteria comes directly from the job description, right? So just wanted to kind of highlight that to show folks what it actually looks like. This is, I think we took this from an actual screening criteria and modified it just so it could serve as a sample, but this is exactly what it looks like when we're doing it for a real, for a committee. The other thing, mission, obviously we ask folks to also look at the department, right? Like in the college, to review like the mission, the values, right? Like to just have an understanding of the common language that the department or the college uses, right? To try to see, what kind of trends they might notice, right? and to familiarize yourself with that language, just so that you see if there's some alignment between some of the work that you do, some of your own personal values, right, or your professional values, so that you can articulate those. Understanding the politics of the department, I think, is also important, right? If you've been working in that department, you may have already established some relationships with other faculty members, especially full-time faculty members. So I think it's always, I would say it's wise to, have a conversation with a faculty member, about, I'm preparing for this job, for this position. Is there any feedback? Is there anything that you could, help me understand about the position and ways that I could prepare? This is very, I think this is very common. I don't think it's uncommon. Obviously, if that faculty member is sitting on the committee, they're likely going to tell you that they that they can't talk to you about it, right? Because they're sitting on the committee. Don't be discouraged by that, right? If a faculty member says, I'm uncomfortable talking to you about it because I'm on the committee, be like, okay, cool. Actually, thank you for letting me know, and I don't no longer want to talk to you, because you also don't want to jeopardize your opportunities, right? Of getting an interview or moving forward if if it's noted that you were talking to a committee member or something like that. So just keep that in mind, right? When people have asked me in the past, right, I typically I try to be very cordial and just say like, I wish I could do that, but I'm on the committee, so I can't really share, or I can't really or if people, peers, right, colleagues have asked me, for a letter of rec, I'm like, I can't do it, I can't do it for that position, and then usually if, they kind of already, folks that have been, in those reels for a while, will already kind of get the hint, right? That I can't write them a letter of rec for that position typically means that I'm on the committee, right? I'm serving as an equity rep. Does that make, yeah.
I was gonna say, one thing I do want to note is I think that there are some of our colleagues, okay, there's gonna be people like Jesus and I know, and I think Veronica, when we've been asked and we're on a committee, that will just straight up say, I'm sorry, I can't help you because I'm on the committee. We're just straight up and direct. I also have colleagues that don't know how to be direct. And they'll just either not answer an email, they'll go radio silence, etc. And I think if you also know those folks, if it will probably fit with their personality type, I would also say to the best of your ability, try not to take that personally, because not everyone will just tell you outright that they're on the committee. I just find it's quicker and easier and fair just to be like, I'm sorry, I'd love to help you, but I'm on the committee. So I just want to put that out there, because I do know that I've witnessed the awkwardness. I've witnessed the kind of weird radio silence, and I saw Veronica smile, so I'm assuming that's a good description. So I just want to put that out there as a note. So
and so I think that's why timing is very important. I think Jesus going back and reviewing those Senate notes, and then at ARC, the president just released a couple weeks ago the faculty hiring prioritization, and it was a memo sent out to the entire campus. That memo there. If you're looking for a position, looking for that memo, do I see my department? Timing is everything. And so the earlier you can see if a position's open in your discipline, then at that point you still have this window. You have a window right now, right? So, and then I think I just saw a question, can we get access to that memo if we're at other campuses? Yeah, you should, because Senate notes are public documents.
It's a Brown Act. So the thing to know about Senates across the state, that they are Brown Act organizations, which means you must publish your notes and all affiliated documents that are talked about in Senate. So so if you actually type up Senate for, I'm going to just use one of our sister colleges, Woodland Community College Senate. You go onto, they should have a website that lists all documents that were public. The same for us. And I think that and I also know for us, our hiring prioritization at SCC got released through our Senate. And so it came up in our Senate board documents. So, but yeah, they are Brown. Anything that's Brown Act has to be published. And but also the Board of Trustees are a Brown Act organization. And that is usually under what we call the consent calendar or consent forms. So there are things that the board just will say, okay, we all agree that all 20 items under here go. So the hiring prioritizations fall under consent for the Board of Trustees almost at every district. And so if you don't find it in the local Senate, although I do think local Senate minutes are easier to access, you can find it in the Board of Trustee minutes. In terms of, there's a question here about how does the hiring committee ensure fairness?
Yeah.
In my experience, I've seen the bias and the push to hire people who don't actually meet the need of the position. Is it just a toss up? Also, how do we find feedback after we interview?
So I want to take a crack at the first part, right? So it is really hard. It is really difficult to to construct that kind of like coercion, right, of a hiring committee, right? I think we want to, we want to, I don't know, like mythicize the idea that like, oh, the whole committee got together, talked about it, and they said, no, absolutely, that person is not gonna get the job, or we really like this person, so we really want to give them the job. It would be so, I mean, on all the committees that I've served, just those conversations are not happening, right? Because everybody is kind of on their own, like everybody's kind of on their best accord because, like I don't even know what would happen if a committee member, actually I have heard of it happening where like committees are dismantled, right? Or like the position has to be put out again because there was like some funny business going on in the committee, right? So there are, I guess they happen, right? And that is usually what ends up happening, that the committee that gets dismantled and a new committee is formed. But at least in my experience, folks are generally on their, on their best behavior. And I've been in committees where I know everybody socially in that committee. You know what I mean? I know like these people have been to my house, I've been to their house, everybody in that committee I am cool with. And none of that is happening.
Yeah, Jesus, and I think I want to add to that, like, I think the faculty on committees, at least the ones that I've been on, we check each other.
Yep.
We check each other. There is like, if someone says something, it's like, you can't know, right? So there is that own checking of each other as colleagues to making sure that does not come into the space.
Yep.
But again, that's been my experience in being in committees.
So there's the faculty that check each other, but then you also have the equity rep that's also there to check you. And then you have the dean that's there, right? So you have, think of all these different, like within the committee, there's all these like systems of checks and balances. And then, somebody else comes in at the end of the interview process and they also, right, like usually is the vice president of the area, and they'll also, hear information, and they're also there to kind of check to make sure that there's no, obvious, bias happening. And then by the time that you get to the second interview, that's a whole new committee, right? So it's like, even if that first committee was pulling for somebody, they would still have to get through the second interview, which is a whole new committee, right? So it is, I think it is incredibly rare that a candidate has that much, that can have that much, political pull, right, to like get themselves all the way through that process, because people gave that person favors. You know what I mean? Like that would be, yeah.
The other thing I want to add is like, as equity rep, for example, I've been in a situation, for example, where I looked at the scores, and and it wasn't the whole committee, but I looked at the scores, and one person I felt was really sort of out of line with their scoring, and I reported it forward. Right. I also know the same committee that Jesus talked about it in terms of the sort of hijinks of some individuals in that committee, where they tried to replace the equity rep with someone internally, et cetera. This is also why they require that the equity rep not be from that department as well. And usually, if possible, not from the division. But that I also, in that case, the equity rep and I believe the dean went to the administration saying that this is not okay, and they dismantled that committee. And then I would also say that even on the front end, in the construction of committees, the Senate president plays a very crucial role in looking at the committee and say, and understanding the dynamics. So I think that the other thing is that under by law, the equity rep, if a member of the committee, like let's say, Jesus said, man, someone made all this commentary because Veronica's a vegan and they don't like vegans, but I don't know what to do about it. Then my job is to say, look, they're discriminating against Veronica because she's a vegan, right? We have to do something about it. So there's all of these weird protocols, but it actually does, as equity rep, I would tell you that you hear about it in different ways, but the rigid scoring and the fact that people are, especially the equity rep and the chair of the committee, are looking at these scores, as well as the commentary. People have checked each other. You can't say that. You can't say anything about vegans or whatever. Not that I'm picking on vegans. I'm picking on Veronica is really what I'm doing. So, that people literally do check people like that,
And there's also a part that even there's a part of the scoring of the interview where you don't even see the names, right? You oftentimes just see the scores, right? So as a committee, you don't know, you're voting on who, what the bottom line is, right? Or what the cutoff is. And you still, it would be impossible to know, unless, again, there would have to be a significant amount of coercion by everybody involved, for folks to engage with that kind of hijinks. So there's just too many pieces in there that make the process, very, very formulaic, tedious, boring, less exciting than I think what we want to imagine, right? Which is that, people are in there, fighting for their buddies, right? That's, I think, what we want to. I think that's the myth that there's some sort of cool kids or good old boys club, or all these kind of things. The reality is a lot more boring than that. It is the job description determines the screening and the interview questions, and then folks score just based on what's being presented, which is why it is such an awkward experience, as somebody has highlighted, right? Because you're sitting there and you're interviewing in front of people that you might know, so you feel like, do I say this? They know this. Do I need to repeat myself? The answer is yes, right? You have to assume that these folks don't know you and you're giving them content to evaluate you, right? Because the committee cannot use anything that is not articulated, right?
If it's not said, not on the app, then it doesn't exist. So yes, be redundant if they know you. I didn't want to miss the interview part of that. Second part of that question is, by law, we're supposed to keep everything confidential, and that's a real hard part about the interviewing piece. And I think that one of the things I feel like Veronica, you and I had a conversation about this, is that all of us tend to make the same mistakes if we actually practice on the front end. That we do in the interview. So one of the things that we do talk about is finding a group of people who are not on the committee who you can do mock interviews with, or also know this. I also want to note that there's a part 2 to this workshop that we're not sure who's going to do it within LRCFT's board, but that talks specifically about the interview process. We just felt that going into break, it was really important to cover the materials and packaging on the front end. And that when we come back in January, we'll work on making sure we put together a how to interview workshop, although we could probably field a few of those. So I didn't want to ignore the second part of that question.
Yeah. There's a question about are only full-timers equity reps? I believe so, or no? Can part-timers serve as equity
training? I think anytime you've gone through the training, you can be an equity rep. I think the hard part is being on a hiring committee. Is uncompensated labor for part-timers. And so I think that generally speaking, that's why the full-timers serve as equity rep, is because we write it off as our service. So it's sort of one of those, it doesn't fall under the list of compensation. Not that it shouldn't, and we shouldn't think about that contractually, but as of right now, it's uncompensated labor, so it falls under service. So full-timers tend to do it more. But there's a two-part, usually you'll see the hiring the best workshop, which is to be on the hiring committee. And then part 2, there's usually another workshop immediately following, like an hour later, where you get qualified to be the equity rep, and you have to do this every 2 years, 2 years, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So, and the last thing that I wanted to kind of bring to the table was something that a couple folks have posed, which is about the second interview, right? Like, how do you prepare for the second round of interviews? And that is a little more complicated because usually the second round interviews, those questions are tailored to you based on the feedback from the first committee, right? So it's a little bit more difficult to prep for that second round, right? For the first round, you can prep by looking at the job description consistently, right? You can prep your resume and your letters by looking at the job description. You can prep for the interview by, again, looking at the job description, right? And making sure that you're ready to speak to your experience in those areas, because they will likely, the questions will, come from the job description. But I'm going to be honest here. I don't know what kind of recommendations would my colleagues here give to the second job interview. How do folks prepare for the second job interview?
Good, Veronica.
Yeah, I was thinking, so when it comes to the second one, like even having gone through it and then being on a committee and recommending, it still goes back on the job description,
Okay.
right? The second level is now going to dive deeper. How do you fit? What uniqueness are you going to bring to the department given the overarching umbrella of the job description? So now is going to be that opportunity to give in extra details. What makes you different? Because the first layer, sometimes you run out of time, right? It can be 45 minutes to 50 minutes. You got lots of questions, a little bit of nervousness. And so you're going through all these questions, you're answering. That second level is going to be that opportunity to dive in a little deeper. And so really giving those extra details that perhaps maybe didn't come up at that first level. But this is where, like I think Belinda said, how do you walk on water? Like how do you walk on water? And that's the space to do it.
So I think I understand the question a little bit better now, but I was going to say there's a couple of things that we would recommend, right? And I think we're all willing to share some examples of documents like our cover letters and CVs and materials on the front end. But I think the other side of it is when folks are interviewing, I'm going to say that there are a number of standard questions that are always asked. Why do you want the job at Sacramento City College? Why do you want the job at American River College? Seemingly benign question, but that is where you need, and it'll always be the first question. That is where you need to tell us who you are, right? I'm assuming, Jesus, you came out of Sac City College, that part of your narrative is like, look, growing up in Sacramento, went to Sac City College, et cetera. Or for me, it was like, look, what I bring is commitment, dedication, et cetera. But part of what you need to be able to infuse into that is, one, I did my research on the institution. And it doesn't matter if it's Sac City College or LA City College or San Diego Mesa College, right? They want to know, do you know what we stand for, right? Do you know what we're about? And this is how I fit. It's a two-part thing. So it comes off as, why do you want to work here? Your narrative needs to be built around that, and should also, even for people who may know you, shine a light on what makes you unique and special that maybe they haven't seen you in that light before.
Yeah, I think you've highlighted a very important point, which is, in that first question, usually that first question, holds about as much weight as any other question, right? I mean, I've seen, in the committees that I've served, it is usually scored or holds the same amount of points, right? So it is a very important question. And I think sometimes it is disregarded, and I think is not addressed directly to the campus, right? Sometimes I think folks talk about why they want to teach, right? Or why they want to teach in that area, right? So I think, it would be is important if you want to, stand out, is to talk about that particular campus and that particular department, right? And, to speak to what the department is already doing and how you want to support it, right? That's something that I would definitely recommend. I definitely would discourage folks from talking about, the flexibility of the schedule, the time off, like that. That may be the reason why we've decided to be academics, right? Like that may be the reason why we enjoy, being faculty members. But that may not get you the best points.
Like we want to, I would tell you that also think about your answers in tandem with materials that you produce, especially your cover letter and your CV, right? Mm-hmm. Where it's like, as I noted in my CV, and then as Veronica said, then you do a deep dive. right? Like I was born and raised in Sacramento, but what you don't understand is that I went to school at McClatchy and then walked down the road afterwards as a dual enrolled student and came to Sac City College. Or, you know, there's different versions of that. Or I'm a community college student and I understand the meaning of having a strong mentor in my education. You know, tell us a little bit about, it's an invitation to tell us about yourself and to humanize yourself. That's like I said, in an interview, I would say that the successful candidates don't just repeat what's in the materials, but they humanize themselves. And both as like, this is who I am as a human being, but also this is who you get when I'm in the classroom. Because I think that on the faculty side of things, you know, we're looking for colleagues, right, that we know are going to, not only that we get along with, but also are going to be engaged and equally committed to student success, right, in sort of meaningful ways. But I definitely think that making sure that you highlight who you are relative to that, and that you infuse, and in terms of getting to the second interview, I would say that humanizing yourself piece, also like when they ask you a question of, you know, so Veronica, tell me about how you infuse equity into your teaching. Don't feel that you just have to rigidly adhere to just the question, right? But you may say something about, you know, look, as a first generation immigrant, whatever, right? Or as a first in my family to go to college, take moments to humanize yourself, even in relationship to a question like, you know, how do you infuse equity into your teaching? Which, by the way, is another standard question that's going to come up in some version of it. At least every committee I've been on, I don't know if Veronica or Jesus would agree that some version of that question comes up now. And for counseling, it might be culturally relevant counseling. There's different versions of the same question. You know, what does equity in counseling look like, or student services look like? I think that in terms of getting to the second interview, I'm also going to tell you, for those of you on the classroom side, that do not take the teaching demo for granted. It should be polished, it should be tight, and you should be able to end on time. So I always tell people when I'm coaching them, they'll tell you, it's going to vary by campus. So like, I would tell you hypothetically, we had 3 positions open in ethnic studies. At one campus, there was a 10-minute presentation. At the and the other 2 might have been 15 minutes, right? But I would tell you on the teaching demo, it should be tight. You should come in right at time. You should think about how you would really teach it, but you should pick it to the best of your ability. It should reflect your A game as a teacher. So if they give you an open script, like just tell us how you would teach something in a race and ethnicity class, pick the home run class lesson that you do. It may look different for people who have to do labs and those kind of things in the sciences. So Veronica, I don't know if you have other things you'd add to the sort of teaching demo piece.
I mean, for STEM, I think challenge yourself, but like Belinda says, like it has to be something that comes organically to you and represents your A game. Don't do something new that you're not comfortable with doing, right? That's not the time to try something that you know you just haven't practiced, or do something that you are comfortable with, you're solid on. You know, especially when it comes to STEM, like how again, you're going to be different in how you bring in your expertise to engage students in these, you know, in a science discipline.
I'm looking at some of the comments in the thing. Yeah, I mean, it is like the going a different direction piece. I mean, I would tell you that I think at the point of the call, I mean, and this is really hard to do in the moment that you're getting bad news. I think that's the one moment that you have the opportunity to ask a dean, like, so, you know, are there areas I can improve on? They may or may not disclose, but sometimes they do. The committee members themselves are like, we only, for those of us who serve on committees, we only get to deal with the first level. And then after that, it's out of our hands. It's literally the dean, the vice president, and the president. So I'm seeing this, and that's really real. And so I was going to say, like, really, I think one of the things to try to do when you have that initial call would be to say, so what do you mean by a different direction, right? And it's hard. I'd also tell you, I think it's really hard because it depends on who you get the call from and are they willing to how much are they willing to share, right? And it's really sort of unequal across the board. That's one of the things I would say, which is not what you want to hear, but that's the only thing that I could think of. I mean, I don't know if Jesus and Veronica have other kind of comments on some of the pieces here that Leisha shared in the
Yeah,
chat.
I was thinking about that, but just to be frank, is we don't really have much insight on that second part, because that's an admin only space, right? The equity rep is no longer there, right? It is you're mostly interviewing with the dean, the vice president, and the president. So there's not any insight that I have that I could share, from the screening process, from the interview, the first round interview. I'd be happy to share, but beyond that, I've never outside of my own second interview, haven't participated in any.
I think one of the things I would say is that the committee, the extent to which the first grouping, the first committee, the first level interview committee has a say, is that when we give our feedback, we may have questions. So let me note, it works differently in every district. In our district, that second level committee has the ability to go off script, meaning they may go in depth, they may ask similar questions to what was asked in the interview. But the committee has also said, well, we were a little unclear about Belinda's ability to teach community college. Actually, I know that's for a fact what they said, because her resume has no community college experience. I walked into the second interview and at the time, President Jeffries looked at my resume right off the bat, was like, so Belinda, I went through your resume, you don't teach community college. How can you teach a Sacramento City college? So part of it is you're going to need to know you have to know that there are going to be some things that they are absolutely going to ask you about, right? Oh, so I noticed that you have been a long time adjunct in psychology, but you haven't taught stats. Can you show me how you're prepared? Right? Because it's in the job description, right? That you need to be able to teach psych stats. So I think part of it is being able to justify what were either weaknesses that are on your resume, or I also think that that when we take time to reflect on our own interviews, that there might have been a question that you just didn't hit out of the park, or you just know you were a little off on. Be prepared to bolster your answer in that areas. So we have a secondary committee that will go off script. Now, I've also been at other campuses where they went completely scripted. So when I did Las Positas and Pasadena City College and in San Diego, when I interviewed with them, it was two of those four, it was a scripted interview just like it was in the first round. And they went off of a rubric, and the other two were conversational. So that's what's really hard about this. But this is where I do think humanizing yourself as someone who belongs at that institution is incredibly important, right? And highlighting the intangibles that you bring, I think speaks really well in that second level interview, right? Because that is what makes it hard, is that, yeah, I could do the equity work, but this is really how I approach relational teaching. Or these are struggles that I understand happen in math labs, and this is how I work through students who exhibit math anxiety. So I think thinking through what opens up a door into who you are is really important in that second interview. In terms of, I think there was a question about the most underrepresented or marginalized groups within faculty. If you look at our percentages by race and age, you'll see that over 40 is that area where in terms of age, historically underrepresented groups, we sort of mirror our DI populations across the district, and it may look a little different at each campus, right? So it may be, so I would also tell you Latino and Latinx and African American, Native American across the board in terms of our racial demographics. And it may be Asian Pacific Islander depending on discipline, and it'll be a little bit different. Veronica, I know you're on the DI committee, so is that about right for you all over at ARC as well, or?
Yeah, yes.
So I think that a couple of things that maybe we should just, with the time left, do you want to talk about, because I think all three of us have very different approaches to how we thought about like cover letters, or how we approached what to put in the cover letter, what not to.
Well, I don't know if we want to open it up for questions, because I know the chat box is going on, but I want to give space if there is questions that you guys in the audience want to specifically ask.
I mean, this is like Shia, if I can ask a question or just make a comment, if that's okay.
Yes, please.
Yeah, I mean, I put in the chat, I've been on so many interviews, not only within Los Rios, but in other districts and everything too. And the response is always, wow, you interviewed so well, made it to the second round, you're so amazing, you're a great counselor, we want someone like you, but you know what, we're gonna do something different. And it's one of those things where when you look at like the left out report and you really do research on the university or the campus you're trying to get hired at, when all the academics in it are white, when people in positions of power are not people of color, when hiring committees are not full of people of color or have people of color on the hiring committees, it makes it really difficult not to think this is racism, not to think that it's because my name or my hair or I wear a scarf or what. And it's like, we're exhausting ourselves doing everything, getting in all the committees, doing academic senate, volunteering, adjuncts, we're only able to work 68%. So no matter if we're working at FOC, ARC, or Sac City, we're still getting the same amount of money. And I'm driving to Woodland and FOC, and it's like, what is it that y'all want? Like, what is it that we need to do? What is it that you guys already have a picture of what you're trying to hire? We've had a person, even at FOC, when they had positions open for permanent positions, I didn't even get interviewed, and I've been at FOC since 2015. They didn't even interview me for a permanent position. So it's kind of like, it leaves a really bad taste, I think, in the back of the palate, and it's hard not to think, well, what else is it then? What is it? And I know there's thousands of people applying. I know I'm not unique. I see the chat, I'm not unique, I'm not special. But in the same token, I am special. The experiences I bring to your campus, you're not going to get that anywhere else, right? My lived experiences bring something that you are not going to get, right? How I approach students, how I connect with students is totally different than maybe a different counselor because of my experiences, because of my history and where I come from. But it's like, are you looking for that though? Is that what you're looking for? And if that's not what you're looking for, then no matter how great I am, no matter how much stuff I put on my resume, how many things I do, is not going to be enough. And I'm fully Black, and I don't mean that in any, people aren't Black. I'm saying I wear things that represent who I am. I make my hair to make sure I'm representative of my culture. I advocate for students who look like me, because at my campus, no one does. And a lot of counselors do not, so it's really frustrating and disappointing, and it can be very deflating to do all these hiring committee workshops and all this stuff, and then the fruition of that just is so few and far between, especially for people of color. And it's just really frustrating. It's really hard to feel motivated and to want to work in a company that you can be an adjunct for 18 years, but we're not going to hire you full time. What is that? Who does that? And why would you do that to people that you want to come to work and be in a good emotional and mental space to work with students? And so I think that we need to really think about the biases and the racism on these hiring committees, and think about the people in power. Think about, like, really look out the left out report and the people who are a part of the campuses you're really going to look and trying to get hired on, and see if they even want someone that looks like you. Because if everybody in positions of power are white, or there's only one or two people of color or women, that's problematic. And I think that we need to just be more truthful about that it might not be anything that we're doing. It could just be that we're just not the right fit because of other things, but it's hard not to think, is it my name? Is it because I'm Black? Is it because and it's hard not to think that when you're a person of color, when everything that you see every day sometimes is related to how you look, how you sound, what you dress like, and you're treated differently because of that. And it's hard not to bring that into the workplace when education, the gatekeepers of education are white people. And I think we have to be honest and not shy away from the facts.
Well, can I just add something to that? And I just want people to understand better all the factors that are going on. I'm white, male, and I'm past retirement age. So I really have wanted to get a full-time job teaching down here. But just so you know, I got a PhD, I got a postdoc, blah, blah, blah. And nobody in the kind of department where I came from, which is UC Davis, nobody that was a white male got a teaching job in California at the time. And I am happy to go to Washington to get a job up there doing research. I felt like shining shoes almost, just because that was what was default, where white males could go. Everyone that I knew that was female or ethnic was able to get jobs in California. Every white male that I know of in the department for many years was not able to get a job. And they got everybody in my group, which was a large group, went out of state. And that was right out of school. And it's been worse since. And I've never been able to get a job per se in California and on a level field. So here at 20, 30 years, and now I'm running into the fact, well, maybe I'll never get a job. I have no chance because I'm white male. Okay. So it's on the flip side, I feel the same thing. And I have a track record of being qualified with all the background experience and teaching and everything to the nth degree, and not feeling I have a chance at all of getting a job. So I've been an adjunct, I'm going on 7 years now, to the Los Rios, and I feel like I have no chance. And I've talked to other people in my group or the group at CRC, and one guy said he applied, he finally got a job after 9 years, and he had all the qualifications in the world. He was UC Davis professor, he's teaching over there, doing research over there, getting grant money, and he finally got a job after 8 years. He was about ready to throw his hat in, and it just goes on and on. So just so you can not feel as bad, it's like across the board, you might feel like there's a club, but I feel like there was apportionment when I came out of school at 35. Now I'm almost 70 or something, and I feel like I've never had a chance getting a job in the Bay Area or the Sacramento area. Okay. And so for whatever that's worth, to make you feel better, I mean, that's the flip side of things. And so now I feel like I'm running into equity, and there's nobody ever to talk with about this. And there's nobody to talk with COVID regulations about why getting vaccines is necessary. I mean, we're being dictated to now, and I think it's really scary. I'm almost scared to open my voice right now about this stuff. Okay, but anyway, just so you can feel better.
Well, let me actually interrupt right here real quick. I think that we're going into very dangerous territory here in terms of, I think on the one hand, I think it's really important to understand that equity, as it's mandated by the state chancellor's office, it's part of our student-centered funding formula, is about student success and meeting the needs of the student. And at Los Rios, I think it's incredibly important for us to acknowledge that 60% of our students are at or below the poverty line, and that depending on our campus, we can be serving up to 70% students of color. And the question becomes, how do we adequately, as teachers, counselors, et cetera, serve them? The flip side, I also want to, and that when we talk about hiring people to meet the needs, right, is are you using for the classroom side, are you using teaching techniques, et cetera, that address those student needs, that call them in, that also help students actually graduate? The flip side, and I don't want to lose what Licia said, I think all three of us would say we would be lying if we didn't say that there aren't gatekeepers like at every other institution. And I think that all of us may have entered different programs and spaces and places at very different times. And that it is an absolutely imperfect and frustrating and trying process. But I would also say, I guess the only thing that I could add to that, Licia, and I think that for me is that one of the myths, right, is that equity is about you don't hire white people. That's not it at all. It's about how are you going to help the demographics of that school succeed in your department and that school succeed. I think the flip side of it also is how do we begin identifying those obstacles, whether it's racism, sexism, et cetera, like pick it, right? And I think that's still the work to be done, but I also think that all three of us would say we'd be lying if we didn't know that there was gatekeeping.
And I think that as I'm thinking about this, and just my again, I only have my experience to speak from, right? And obviously, my the various data supports what a lot of people are saying here, right? That there are these issues, right, around various kind of explicit biases and implicit biases, right? But what I think about, or what I go back to again with my experience on serving on various committees, is that like, yes, these are significant truths, but unless everybody's operating, within that committee with that like very strong implicit bias, right? Like we're not, I don't know, like we don't see a lot of those elements in when we're identifying. And again, I'm only speaking to this, so I don't want to make a broad, generalization, because I haven't served on, committees where folks have been told that, and I don't want to, invalidate the experience of people. But I guess what I think needs to be fixed more is that the job description does not allow to recognize all of these valuable experiences, right? The folks are talking about, right? So our lens is being shaped by this job description, but the job description is limited, right? So it's not allowing for all of that kind of intersectionality to be validated. I don't know if that makes sense, right? I mean, right now we're just having more of an open dialogue about the issue, more so than me answering a question. But I think, I'm sort of receiving all this feedback to think about the ways that we could improve improve the process, right? As opposed to just pretend like it's not happening, right? As opposed to say that, no, this is not happening because of all these different systems that we have in play. I think somebody highlighted it before, that I think that some of the systems they're working to a particular end, but we haven't been intentional enough to make sure that there's no further biases activated in that system.
So just a couple of things that I would also say, that this doesn't remedy in any way some of what Licia had talked about and that others of you experienced, but for some of us, it may also be about what pre-work do we want to do in making a decision to apply. One of the things that I often encourage, right, is if you know people at other campuses or through your networks can connect to somebody at that campus to see if it's worth your time to apply. I think that those are important conversations, because I do think it's important to be protective of our time, our energy, and our mental health as we move forward in some of these things. I think second, I would also tell you to take a look at like their hiring manuals and some of the other things going on around campus. I know for me, this was in the end for me, when I could go back and look at some of the institutions and could see it in the materials early on about where this sort of commitment is. But I do think there's no better way to connect, to be able to figure things out than to ask faculty at other spaces if you can find the connections there through the discipline. And I think it's so in that case, and going back to what Veronica talked about, working early, let's say, Veronica's in your department and you're like, hey, Veronica, I happen to know any people at Mesa College that I might be able to chat with. I would tell you that, like, for example, on the ethnic studies search, I serve on a statewide committee, and a number of my colleagues there said, hey, can we have someone talk to you about Los Rios or the different campuses? And I said, sure. And of course, there's some things I can't answer, but I'm always happy to do so. So I really also want to, I absolutely want to affirm that. And I agree with Licia as what you're saying, like absolutely representation matters. I would tell you that the different Senates, I know that our Senate president at Sac City and has been very vigilant about, the last two Senate presidents have been extremely vigilant about the composition of committees, including switching equity reps so that they follow all the particular rules. And I think that those are all, I think that again, they're imperfect, but it is absolutely,
Well, yeah. And I wanted, Laisha, I just, when I was reading the chat and I was listening, and I'm going to tell you right now, I hear you. And your story made me go back to what I experienced as a part-timer. And so given that, so I applied 3 times and I went in for that 4th one. I don't know what happened in that 4th one that got me to the 2nd level that got me to get the position. But I know when I got to that fourth interview, just getting the interview, I detached, because at that point, as I said, and probably many of us who are part-timers said, has said this to ourselves, like, you know what, this is the last time I'm going to do this. This is it. If I don't get it, yeah, basta, I'm done. I'm going to go do something else. Right. And so I just kind of threw it all in there. Like, I just like, look, if they're going to give it to me, they're going to give it to me. I'm just going to be my full authentic self. And let me tell you, I guess because I knew that if I didn't get a job, I had already told myself, like, I had already said, like, if this doesn't happen, I'm done. And it just became a very organic interview that there was a lot of laughing, like a lot of laughing. And OMG, I mean, like, I don't know what happened, but I feel you. I was totally detached in that last interview. So Laisha, I hear you. And I don't know if that detachment is what made the difference for me. I don't know. I can't tell you, because when I got the call that I got the job, can I just tell you, I cried. I cried. And I think I cried because I said, oh my God, I got the job. So I hear you. I hear you.
And I also want to add, to this conversation, I mean, just because the other thing is, like, once we get in the door, once we, at least I'll speak from my experience, that's a full-time factor. It ain't like any kind of prejudice that I experienced as a part-timer just ended once I became full-time, right? It's not like I entered the department meetings and, campus and it's like, hey, I'm tenure track now and everything is all great, good and great. It's like, what? No, still, a lot of those same issues that we're speaking on right now are gonna, persist, right? Like, there's still gonna be, elements of, implicit bias, some of your colleagues not taking you as serious sometimes, or taking, at least for me, not taking me as serious sometimes, or presenting ideas that get completely devalued, and then somebody else presents them, and then they get, a high, so there's all these different, it's just not a part of, it's not as clear cut, I think, as is being presented sometimes, especially within the conversation of like the 2-class part, right? It's not like once you enter this first class, then you're, full-time, then all of a sudden, all of that stress, and all of that kind of goes away. I mean, I feel like every single time I've walked into my tenure track review, I was like, well, this might be it. I'm walking into my dean's office with my performance review committee, and I'm thinking, damn, if they say, like, if they tell me that, if they tell me no, I'm gonna, or if they tell me I got to do this different, or just preparing myself to potentially walk away from, from the position that I worked really hard for, because it's a consistent, experience, right? It's not like I got the full time and the entire system changed its mind about, who I was and how they were going to treat me and, embrace me with open arms, right? Is an ongoing.
So I'm just gonna put the link for the sign in one more time into the chat real quick, and I'm gonna apologize because I have to make a quick exit.